Hey, how's it going, folks?
Hey, Dion, how are you?
Yeah, really good. Danny, how you doing?
It's great to be here, Dion. Kaipo, great to join you again.
Yeah, nice. Well, I'm gonna go off screen and let you guys chat and be watching for questions so we can do Q&A later on.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dion. Danny, thanks a lot for sort of coming in. I know we kind of barged in on a day of recordings. I think you've had a whole bunch of them today on it, so we'll test you out live here on it.
That works. I don't usually
making the
wear a
time.
sport coat, but just for you today, I wore a sport coat.
Yeah, you're doing it, sort of wearing the formal wear is like I guess if anybody knows anything about me, is like definitely sort of in the Snyk original culture, not so much a suit sort of environment on it, but I think as we sort of barged into like protect enterprise customers on it, it's like a little bit of a show me you're serious lens to it that was great. So let me kind of just introduce you a little bit. You know, people have kind of heard too much about me on it, but just talk a little bit, Danny, about your background. Danny's, I've had the pleasure of knowing Danny. Oh wow, I'm sort of I think a little bit embarrassed that now. It's like I think it's not quite 20 years, but it's sort of starting to kind of push that envelope on it as we were building together some of the original AppSec products back in Sanctum Watchfire, and always sort of was always at the cutting edge of sort of understanding where we're building out. Ended up continuing to lead some research and security research at IBM after it acquired Watchfire, which we worked at together. And then through a bunch of sort of startup journeys, before Snyk was CTO at Veeam Software, talking also about sort of a different type of risk, right? Sort of managing backup software in big volume in the world of cloud, which was not always embracing. We'll touch on that in a little bit. Security as a first principle on it, and then lastly, you know, we got the chance to draw you in to Snyk to come and be Snyk's CTO on it, which is very exciting. So like a long, amazing history that I've had the pleasure of sort of working with you in some parts of it in the world of risk, of security of it, and today sort of dive in a lot into AI. So did I get any of that sort of wrong over there, Danny, on it? Any key pieces you want to add?
No, that's 100% it. I always like to remind people I started as a pen tester actually doing security testing, but I don't do very much of that anymore. It's been a fun journey, and actually working with you alongside you over the years has made it even better. So great to be here.
So I guess we're gonna go from kind of go through a little bit maybe the unpleasant topic of hey, you can just sort of vibe code your way and sort of have and not carry some consequences. We're gonna try not to be sort of too much sort of doom and gloom, you know, because I think we're both believers in it. And maybe just to before we cap in, I know you've been sort of delving into AI today. You're sort of, you know, with the security hat, but also developer hat in Snyk. Do you want to say just a couple of words about the type of AI work that's been happening that you've been immersed in before we get into the subject matter?
Well, I always start the conversation when people ask me about AI of what is AI, because I remember doing, cracking hash codes 20 years ago by chaining up a whole bunch of FPGAs. And so machine learning and we've evolved into where we are today. So I usually like to start with that AI. For myself, at least, when I use the term AI, I tend to think of generative AI, which is more relatively newer in nature. But as you might expect, we've been playing with all kinds of generative AI here on the Snyk side. Certainly the one that comes up the most is generating code, as I expect most of the audience here is using some kind of generative AI in the code world.
Yeah, very much so. I recently heard just like a bit of a snarky but still kind of true remark, which is if it works, we call it ML. If it doesn't work, we call it AI, which was just kind of a little bit funny. Like it's been around for a while.
Yes.
That's the new frontier. So I guess we're going to cover a little bit the security concerns of it, and I guess maybe just to tee that up as a question. So security is a real concern. AI is a very kind of volatile world on it. And generally, the sense I get in conversations is that oftentimes security is a bit of a blocker or at least a very kind of source of anxiety when people are embracing AI. So I guess my question to you for starters is like, what are you seeing? Are you seeing security sort of truly blocking organizations and enterprises from embracing AI into the systems? Is it, are they adopting it anyway, or is it actually slowing down? What are you seeing?
We're definitely seeing them adopt it. What I would say is unequivocally, people are moving forward with AI. If you ask me kind of in the enterprises, the customers of Snyk, it tends to be, certainly coding assistants. We see a lot of that, but you also see a lot of chatbots. You see a lot of support technologies. And I would say well over 80% of our customers are embracing AI within the organization. Now, if you ask me the second question of what is the biggest concern as they're doing that, it is security, but I would say it's not blocking things. It's more of a concern than a blocker in the adoption. In fact, adoption rates are extremely high, especially in the development community.
Yeah. And I'm curious, are you feeling, are the security people you talk to, they wish AI wasn't adopted, or are they also excited to sort of have AI adopted? They're just also afraid of the repercussions.
No, they're excited by it. The developers I talk to all want to use it. In fact, if the organization doesn't allow it, I would say chances are better than 50% for sure that they're using a Windsurf or a Codium or a Cursor or a Copilot or something within their environment. So they're definitely excited and energized by it. The one thing I would say is sometimes because this comment is now everyone's a developer, sometimes I think, well, really? Just because you know how to talk to a prompt, does that make you a developer? So there is, there's some cynicism there, but they're all adopting it. They're embracing it, is what I would say.
Right. Yep. And I think, I guess one thing I've been excited to sort of see is that actually probably many people within the security organizations are highly technical, but not good coders. And in that sense, I see many of them actually kind of embracing small tools, the creation of small tools with AI for their own systems, not like the way they would identify attackers, but just sort of integration software or automation software of it, which I think is kind of fun. It's sort of to bring, if you think, harken back to the cloud, if I use that analogy, in cloud, I think there was probably more aversion, or my sense was there was more aversion by the security teams. They kind of preferred to not use it, and here it sort of feels like they're a little bit of a user as well, or an embracer. I don't know if you're sort of seeing that in the world of AppSec as well.
Yeah, I'd say that's definitely the case. And one of the areas is they're using it for curiosity. I unfortunately began my career, I guess, back in COBOL. And so if you ask me what I'm most familiar with, it's languages that are older today are considered older, C and C++ and COBOL and those, and Python, because I did a lot of security testing. But for example, I will freely admit I'm not very good at Golang. And so one of the ways I wanted to do something in Go was, I broke out a coding assistant and I said, hey, can you create this? And so what I'm seeing in the development community is they're using it to both augment skills in areas that they may not have skills, but they're using it to satiate the curiosity of how do I use this in my everyday life.
Yeah, cool. So I guess when people are assessing a security concern, again, I'm going to probably overdo the cloud analogy over here in this conversation, but when the cloud came about and it had a bunch of sort of security concerns around it, the solution was sometimes expected to come from the cloud itself, from the platform itself. And over time, I guess we've sort of seen platforms like Snyk, platforms like for sort of cloud native development, or like Wiz, or sort of others for sort of CSPM and such, actually be the solutions that layer on top of the cloud. So instead of it being built in, I guess, how many do you have a sense of how do people feel about, hey, the models will just become secure, or these sort of code generations, they will kind of fix it on their own, versus a need for sort of dedicated security solutions sort of above the fold?
Well, AppSec people definitely believe that it's not going to secure itself, and developers generally are more optimistic and think that it will secure itself. And I think that both are true. The analogy to the beginning of Cloud Guypo is actually super relevant, because if you think about when the cloud first started taking off, I mean, it was booming because people were saying, hey, I can get ROI, or I can get footprint in an area that I don't have. And if you fast forward after the inception of cloud 2 or 3 years, 3 big things were a result of that. One is we're still dealing with the security misconfigurations of storage, right? Open S3 buckets, no one was doing anything about that. Then there was over permissive IAM and access controls. And thirdly, there was very poor visibility and logging. And I would say that those same three concepts apply equally to AI. It's very much the same. And security people who are aware of this and know this say, this is the era that we're entering into. We're setting ourselves up for failure if we don't consider security going forward.
Right. Yeah. And they can anticipate that. And of course, some of the question is, well, what can you do about it? And I think, I guess another topic we've had in when we think indeed about sort of cloud and about application security is this notion of like transcending fragmentation, right? Of if you're using one model, it might maybe you have the aspiration that it will sort of secure itself, all those concerns. But when you're using kind of multiple models, do you kind of expect each of them to just sort of secure itself, or do you need something that's overarching? I guess when you're looking at enterprises today, are you seeing them generally like pick a partner and kind of go all in with them, or you're sort of seeing a breadth of tool and kind of model adoption?
Definitely a breadth of model and tool adoption. Even I'll use our organization as an example. We have multiple coding assistants that are being used here, and we're using multimodal things, and we use OpenAI for one thing, we use Claude 3.7 for another thing. And so that is what I would say is typical. And so if you want governance across all the different tools, across all the different models, then you need something that is outside of those environments. And while some models are better than others at securing things, I would say there are zero models that can secure everything. And so having some awareness of the types of weaknesses, I think, is a pretty important thing for most organizations to focus on.
So that's an excellent, precisely to my next question, which is, let's sort of get a little bit more sort of technical. So like, what are the security concerns that people raise the most as you sort of engage with them? And especially when it comes to sort of AI development, right? And in this world.
Well, everyone starts with the OWASP LLM top 10. So you have model poisoning, data training poisoning, and prompt injection, and over permissive permissions, and all kinds of different vulnerabilities that people are alluding to. In the context of coding, I would say...
Maybe I'll just sort of pause you a second. Do you mind sort of saying a little bit about the OWASP top 10 and the OWASP LLM top 10, sort of the developer audience doesn't necessarily, not everybody might know what those are.
Sure, yeah. So the Open Web Application Security Project has always had a top 10 of vulnerabilities. And in 2023, which 2 years ago was a lifetime ago, but it was 2 years ago, they published a top 10 vulnerability list for LLMs. The first one of those was prompt injection, and it went on from there to model poisoning and data theft and data exfiltration. And you can Google it and find what those top 10 are. I would say even in the 2 years since that came to pass, I would say those vulnerabilities tend to be out of date because we're already facing new vulnerabilities. When you have an agent talking to an agent, there is no concept of the vulnerabilities associated with that. So it's evolving, and it's evolving very quickly, so much so that the standards bodies and organizations like OWASP it's hard to keep up with those vulnerabilities. Some of them, though, I would argue, Guy, are more real than others. In other words, I think some are overhyped, but some are more real and they'll have longevity to them.
So let's dig into that. Maybe like a couple of examples of like which ones do you think? Maybe we'll start with the real ones, and then we'll sort of talk a little bit about the ones blown out of proportion. So like, which concerns do you find? Maybe like if you named your own sort of top three, that we have an audience here of developers or sort of building software. Like, which top three concerns them or their organization should really kind of focus on?
There are two that I personally worry about a lot in the long term. One is around identity and access management. And the reason I say that is because typically LLMs, the large language models, are trained with all kinds of data. And it's not true that everyone inside the organization should have access to all of that data. And so you hear this being used as jailbreaking the system or getting data that you're not supposed to have access to. That is exacerbated tenfold when you have agents talking to agents, which we're beginning to see now, where you have some agent using model context protocol to speak to another agent, and there's no concept of passing on authorization. There obviously authentication has been done, but authorization to the second model. So I worry about that a lot. In the concept of code, let me give you a specific example of this. If you have an LLM that has all of your internal code libraries, you may have code libraries for one group that you don't want exposed to another group. Well, how do you ensure that your secondary agent, your coding assistant, knows that I can access this library set, but not this library set? How do you pass that on? And so That's probably one of my top concerns, is around the data access.
Right.
The second thing is the non-deterministic nature. As a security person, I'm always kind of very linear in thinking of, if I put in this particular, payload, I can exploit the system and get it to do something that I don't want it to do. By their very definition, AI and code generation of AI is non-deterministic. And so having an audit trail and being able to meet compliance requirements is actually really difficult in a world of AI.
Yeah. Very interesting, kind of the notion of attacks. I wonder if it's like a new pattern of attackers in which, like, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes type element. It's like, hey, if this SQL injection didn't work, just try it again in 5 minutes on it. Maybe a new version of AI came along, and maybe that one is vulnerable.
And that manifests itself in different ways, because if you're doing red teaming, like if you're doing sequential prompt injection, you might do the exact same sequential prompt injection a second time and it works, and the first time it didn't, just simply because of the non-deterministic nature. So that could give you an inflated sense of confidence, and that's a problem in a deterministic security world.
Yeah, absolutely, because you can't really attest to anything having kind of some longevity to it. And how I guess, how are people dealing? So let's sort of focus on those two. I guess the first one is, I think, more of a constraint, right? I very much relate to like identity access, and instead of me sort of narrowing it down, let's talk a little bit about those two cases, and maybe what are some sort of mitigating controls, or what can someone do except for don't use AI, right? Or don't use LLMs.
Well, I never recommend that. I'm a big believer in embracing it. But on the authorization, authentication, mostly authorization, less authentication side, we're beginning to see it worked into some of the underlying frameworks. So you're beginning to see extensions of MCP, Model Context Protocol, to have authorization in there. And in fact, we're a member of the Consortium for Secure AI. And so you're beginning to see these frameworks. The A2A framework's another one. Google announced that at Google Next a month ago or so.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time didn't have any authorization in it, but already the working groups are coming together and saying, hey, let's introduce it. So my hope is, and Microsoft has embraced that, so now you have two giants both embracing the same concept. So my belief is that in the longer term, we'll start to work in authorization and identity and access management into the systems. The non-deterministic nature.
It's to an extent, it's like you wait for the industry standards to firm up. You participate in them if you are, like if you care enough and are able to do so. And I guess in the meantime, you sort of avoid topics that require them because they're just not satisfied quite yet.
Yeah, I would be very hesitant to do a lot around agent-to-agent communication or agentic to agentic systems because of that. Give it 6 months, give it a year, and I think we're okay. That's not to say don't embrace AI right now. I'd just be more cautious when you get into the meta layer of talking across systems.
Yeah, and I think that's okay. Like risk reward should always be kind of assessed on it. And I guess on the second problem of dynamic code and the code kind of constantly changing, first of all, like I think that probably relies, like it's especially true for agentic systems that might sort of change the code a bit more dramatically, shall we say. So before, let me kind of do a bit of a side tangent when we come back to this risk. Like I guess how much do you see agentic kind of full on, Devin style sort of agentic systems being used in enterprises? Like, are they still in like, oh, this is really cool, I want to kind of try it out in the corner? Or are you sort of seeing any sort of real adoption on it on enterprise systems?
What I've seen, and this is the segment of the customers maybe that we're dealing with, what I've seen is this is cool, let me try it out on the corner. I kind of group them into three buckets, Guy. I have the highly agentic autonomous ones like Devin. You have kind of the medium ones like Augment that, can do a lot of things, but they're not fully autonomous. And then you have more of the assistant, the Cursor Copilot type style. I would say very few customers within our customer base, at least, are going to the fully agentic. I would say most of them are actually in that lower autonomous model with the Copilots and Cursors, and maybe 20-ish%, 30-ish% are in kind of the middle that are doing very much more augmented code assistance.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. So I guess kind of coming back to the sort of dynamic nature of it, or sort of, like how do you deal with compliance, I guess? How do you kind of pass that? I guess what are there any kind of innovative approaches that you're sort of seeing? Like how are people dealing with that?
Well, a lot of logging and visibility. I said in the early days of the cloud that had these three problems, and the third one was that there wasn't a lot of logging and visibility. And the good news is people are logging it and actually getting interesting metrics out of it. I met with a large financial institution, a customer of ours, that said 11% of our code is AI generated. And I kind of scratched my head and I said, how do you get to 11%? But what they were doing was they were logging all the code that was being submitted into their source control management systems. And then they were logging all the code that was being generated. And they were doing some simple mathematics and division on that. So, whether that's accurate or not, for me, the positive outcome is that they were logging it. They were actually tracking it. And I think we'll see more of that as we go forward.
Yeah, makes sense. I guess maybe let's do some myth busting, of it. So I guess which security concern or two do you feel is you can theorize about it, but it's slightly blown out of proportion?
I tend to think the hallucinations is pretty blown out of proportion. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I just think that over time we're going to see fewer hallucinations. And the reason why we'll see that is mostly because the models will test themselves before it returns output. And so I think hallucinations would be one of them. Identity and access management, I think, will get out of that problem over time. I think data theft is a very low, I'm not saying it's not real, it's definitely real. But if you ask me to rate it on a risk category, I think the likelihood of that being exploited is very low. And so, I always measure things on a risk scale as opposed to an actual security scale. And so while some of these things are real, I think they're lower risk than other areas.
Right. Yeah. And they might be sort of short-term risk. And I guess which when you think about fundamentals, like I guess you in general, when you think about sort of Gen AI and these tools, some flaws are just the baby steps, right? It's just immature yet. It's sort of evolving so rapidly, and some are maybe a bit more fundamental. I guess which security concern or two do you feel kind of have legs here, and they're going to sort of stay? They'll hurt us for a while, or that'll just be a concern that we really need to fundamentally sort of consider because it's gonna be here.
I would go back to the same three things that I said about the cloud, and that's because we don't learn our lessons. In other words, I think that the configuration of AI is a problem and will continue to be a problem, generally around the permissive nature and what data it's trained on and all of that. The second thing being over permissive identity and access management to the data, where we're giving customers access to, let's say I'm training an LLM and I put all of my support data in there. Do I really want to do that if I'm giving customers access to it because they could break out of their set of data? So I think that's the second one. And then the third one, I would go back to the visibility and logging. I think we're going to fall into the same trap that we did before, that we're not doing sufficient visibility and logging, and we end up in the same place we were with cloud after 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, of not knowing what is where and how is it happening. And I guess the other lens I think sometimes about some security concerns are due to the nature of the new technology, and others are they're just an amplification of patterns that we've already seen before, right? So like cloud accelerated development, or like DevOps accelerated, but like Agile came before that, and over time, like just sort of things moved at a faster and faster pace, and similarly maybe like ease of creation improves, and as ease of creation improves, like responsible, like the level of scrutiny or maybe the level of proficiency or professionalism involved in which of these things that goes. And that's true also like when I create images. Like I create images in a very non-professional way, and that's okay. I'm not going to like build any sort of a business around my kind of AI image creation. I guess do you think, does that distinction work for you? And if you had to choose, like which path you think is scarier? It sounds like you're sort of maybe leaning more towards the how we use it versus the tech, but I don't know if I'm misrepresenting.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big believer in that we should use it. Like I am not a slow down at all. We should use AI, embrace AI. I guess I always fundamentally go back to, we need to build in security from the very beginning. The problem that we've historically fallen into, every time we embrace a new infrastructure, doesn't matter whether it's cloud or servers or virtualization or AI, we forget the fundamentals, which are validate your input and code your output, apply identity and access control management. Yeah. Like it's funny, while the threats or the attacks are somewhat different because the infrastructure is different, the root causes for them, Guy, are it's been the same for 20 years. I mean,
Yeah.
remember, right, Shield, we were testing the input that was going to an application, right?
Yeah, a lot of the sort of the same fundamentals. I do find, for what it's worth, that I find myself almost more concerned about the explosion of usage than maybe even the fundamentals of it, which are much more sort of interesting. But so we've kind of seen how security hygiene is eventually the things that organizations actually get breached before.
Yeah, well, what is different today than 20 years ago is there's far more data behind these systems. So the risk is greater if compromise occurs. 20 years ago, there wasn't the same amount of data. And now all of the data is behind there. And if the wrong person gets access to it, that can be very detrimental.
Excellent. So we have, time flies here. We sort of have 5 more minutes. I've got a few more questions to you, and then we have some time for Q&A. So I just wanted to remind everybody that you can post questions in the comments, and we'll have a few minutes for Q&A in a few minutes on it. I guess we're going to try and kind of go dystopian, utopian over here a little bit. So like we called this talk "The Age of Risky Software." Let's talk a little bit about like what is the concern here? What is the the path we need to beware, or is there even one? Right? Is it said to fall? Like, what do we mean by that?
The age of risky software, in the early inception days of a new technology change, is always the riskiest, because the pressure on the business, and I'm sure this is true of everyone in the audience, is use AI, be more productive, go fast, go fast, go fast. And so the early days are the greatest risk. And we are in the early days of AI. We don't understand it. I was listening to a podcast this weekend of, if you said Dave and Buster's in a voice message, the voice message never got delivered on an iPhone. It's still true, by the way, today. So we don't understand.
Like persona non grata type words that are mysteriously avoided. Yeah.
And we don't understand how the AI is working sometimes. And so we're in this age of risky software because we're in this go fast, go fast, go fast, without truly understanding how it's working, how to secure it, doing all the right things. And so we're in the age of risky software.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I do wonder, maybe coming back to sort of the overused sort of a cloud analogy we've been doing here, is when you think about the adoption of the cloud, the initial adoption was similar, like just as you're saying, like pressure to adopt, people used it, and it kind of, there was sort of this like world of possibilities. And we kind of went from a place, like we forget this, but like infrastructure used to be a fairly secure thing. Like people, like the servers and all of that, they were sort of run by a fairly small, very professional, typically very security aware group that was moving way too slow, which is the reason for the drive. And then cloud kind of opened it up, and suddenly people could do it faster, and more people could do it, and oftentimes without any really understanding of what it is that they're performing. And fast forward not that many years after, and until today, as you point out, like misconfigurations and sort of flaws in sort of infrastructure and cloud infrastructure typically are such a massive, maybe the top cause for breaches. And I guess I wonder, as we enable everyone to be a creator, which I love, like in that notion to be a developer of sorts, of a type of developer, like a creator of software, alongside allowing existing developers to sort of run at like a much, much faster speed, maybe with a little bit less kind of scrutiny on it. Like, our vulnerabilities in code, the equivalent, are they going to be sort of our Achilles heel later? And I don't know, like, does that resonate? Is that a conversation, I guess, that and are we doomed to sort of just accept it if it is, because it is what it is, that tech will be adopted?
I'm an optimist. I believe in the long run this will sort itself out. But you've titled this "The Age of Risky Software," and I think that's why that is the case. Like, what we're doing is democratizing coding, clearly. And so we're going fast, and we're opening up the aperture, similar to what the cloud did, to more and more people. And so the result is more code, and more code means more vulnerabilities, right? Now, over time, I think we'll start to implement the controls and the guardrails to secure that. And I also that's why you're still going to have developers. Just because more people can do development, that doesn't eliminate the need for developers. My son's actually in computer science, and he said, "Dad, should I be worried about there not being a need for developers in the future?" And I'd say, that's ridiculous. Of course, there's going to need to be developers. What we're really doing is opening the aperture to more development. And when we do that, what we need are the security guardrails in place to ensure that we don't end up in a similar position that the cloud ended up in, right?
Right. Yep. Just try to anticipate. Hey, Danny, I'm going to switch to a bunch of questions. We actually, here, Dion kind of.
Yes, indeed.
I think I learned sort of the operator system and I found them. Dion over
Got
here.
it. Nice.
So maybe I'll just sort of lean in here and sort of ask Danny these. So Michael Wolf asks, you made a comment on passing authorization authentication around when agents talk to agents. That sounds parallel to passing around ownership and trading value for intellectual property or micropayments. Do you see security and ownership sort of in a similar lens? I guess this is to me more about like what are the sort of the assets and the validity of them that are moving around?
I see the problem as similar, but I see them as very distinct problems. The ownership of intellectual property and with AI is a real issue, and I don't want to minimize it. It's true for music, it's true for art, it's true for code, it's true for language and books and all of this. I can go tell AI to write me a book. Well, who should get paid on that? I'm not sure the answer to that. I think there is a secondary issue that is similar but a different problem that has to do with should they get access to that music, art, text, code,
right,
whatever it happens to be. So parallel but distinct. The reason why the micropayments is important is if we want the proliferation of AI to continue, then there needs to be some model of attribution, because otherwise you're going to lose all the people that are contributing data into the LLMs or the diffusion models that are behind AI.
Yeah. No, I think well said on it. And it's interesting to also think a little bit about the data assets that get moved around with protection on top of them. So that's also interesting. In that case, maybe they do blend a little bit more as almost like DRM style, like you pass along content with some security aspects to it. I guess another question is how will the role of attestation play out in terms of sort of AI agents and sort of a supply chain? Like when you think about creation with AI and such. Jason asked this. You have a view on how?
Here's one where I actually think the government, we're going to see compliance step in. And usually I'm not a big fan of regulation of new technologies because it's very difficult, especially for startups, to deal with it. But I think because of current compliance requirements, if you look at PCI DSS or any of these, regulations or compliance requirements, they require validation of certain things. And so that is going to require attestation of AI native software that is backed by LLMs. And I think this is going to solve itself. My only worry and concern, Guy, is that it becomes very fragmented. What you don't want is a GDPR for every country in the world or every state in the United States. And that's a bad position to be in. So hopefully we consolidate around some very common, well thought out requirements or regulations around attestation.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it also makes sense kind of at the meta level, which is AI will be unpredictable, but there's no reason for it not to be traceable. You might not know, what will happen, but you want to do that. I think I've got two more questions. I think we really kind of have time for one. So one was about the scope of AI security. I'm going to pass on that. Sorry about that. I think it's sort of too big for the time that we have to capture here. I'll ask maybe something a bit more concrete, which is which security checks can developers currently build into their agents to try and mitigate as many risks as possible? Kind of ending on a very practical bit of advice.
Yeah, well, I would say two things. One is if you're using open source components, and actually one of the things that worries me about AI coding assistance, by the way, is that it replaces to some extent open source components and tries to custom create them, because what's the downstream patching and updating of all those open source components? That's a problem. But I would say two things. One is validate the packages that you're pulling in for validation, and then code that you're writing. It's very easy. You can use AI actually to test the data flow across that code and to generate a fix for it. And so if you ask me very practically, what I think you should do is validate your open source packages. And if you're writing custom code, validate that the flow of that code isn't breaking the build in other areas.
Yeah. I love that. And I guess, the more you automate that, the faster you can run, right? And people kind of forget that putting guardrails, it sounds like a cumbersome thing, but actually when you put the guardrails in, when you're sort of running on a bridge with rails, you can run faster because you're not afraid to fall. And so we want to put those in. Time flies. We're sort of here. We are sort of 35 minutes sort of later on it. Danny, huge thanks again for coming in and sharing this knowledge and for I guess investing in AI security.
Well, thank you for having me, Guy. It's a great conversation.
Very cool. And Dion, I think we are ready for our sort of next session. I don't know if you want to sort of sneak in one sort of final question for us.
Yes, I know there are a few more that were in there. I'm really curious about just developer trust. You know, like as developers use all of these tools, like how do they get a feel for what they can and cannot trust? It seems like there's a lot of perception and feel, which is interesting.
It's
cool.
That's a philosophical
Sounds good.
right there.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much for the chat, and really appreciate it. We're going to move on to the next one. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Guy.